Welcome back. And so we're almost now at the end of our series of videos for the class session related to Aristophanes and the first play that we're reading in this course, Clouds. So now you've had an introduction to Aristophanes the playwright, to stage drama in general, and to old comedy in particular as performed by Aristophanes. I also gave you a preview for the video day assignment that's coming up in the next session that pertains to Aristophanes' Clouds. And so you should be now in good shape for this this session of the course related to Clouds. What I'm going to do here is now give you a little bit of a run through on the play Clouds in order to assist you with the video day assignment that you're doing in the next session. I want to mention though that there is going to be another video later about Clouds as well. That's going to be when we have covered the historical event, the Peloponnesian War, because we're going to be relating all the Aristophanes plays to the historical events that pertain to the Peloponnesian War. So you're actually going to be hearing about Clouds again in that later video. But this one will at least assist you with introducing the play so that you can, as I say, relate it to video day, and then also cover some of the specific issues related to this specific play that are rather odd because of its being a revised play. And then the actual real full discussion of that play we'll save for that later video. When we put it in context of the Peloponnesian War. So okay, so for our final video for this session, as I say, we're going to talk about Clouds, and by now you should have read the play and you should be reasonably familiar with its plot. I'll go through the plot here just to review it for you, and then I'll also explain to you how it relates to old comedy, as you just had described for you in the previous video. So as you know from the plot, you have this elderly man, Strepsiades. He has this very young sort of upstart son named Phidippides, a young man, who is totally besmitten with horse racing and gambles quite crazily on it, using, of course, his father's money. Strepsiades himself, who is a relatively poor farmer, happens to be married to a woman from the city who apparently was quite wealthy, and it's on her money that apparently the son Phidippides got started with horse racing. Well, apparently Phidippides has not done very well with his betting, and as a consequence, Strepsiades, the poor guy, is in over head and heels in debt. So he's trying to find a way now for him somehow to get himself out of debt, and he hits upon the solution of visiting the nearby school. In Greek, it's called the Frontisterion, which is basically like the thinkery or the think house. That is run by this mysterious sophist named Socrates. Now, we'll talk about sophists down here, but I wanted to say very quickly that, of course, Socrates is the well-known philosopher. This is indeed the same Socrates. But there's a lot of questions surrounding whether it's correct to call Socrates a sophist. We'll put it here. But he is basically treated as a typical sophist in this play, and again, the later video on Clouds will discuss sophists in more detail, but it's important for you to know right now that there is a disconnect between the concept of Socrates as a sophist, that is a teacher for educational purposes, and Socrates the philosopher in real life, who would have been probably quite a different kind of person, and who was indeed interested in education, but more on a personal self-motivated basis than on the professional basis that we sort of maybe even quasi-professional that we see him here in this play. All right, so Strepsiades goes to visit this school run by the philosopher Socrates. Apparently the real Socrates never actually owned a school like this, but here he is so depicted. And what he's trying to learn from Socrates is the way to conduct an argumentation so that he can get out of debt. So he tries himself to go through the school's curriculum, and he fails miserably. He also is introduced to the Clouds, who are the goddesses in whose debt Socrates himself is in, and for that reason Socrates refuses to worship the current Olympian gods, and for a time persuades Strepsiades also to give up worshiping Zeus and the other Olympians, both of them saying that the Clouds are the only real gods, and that it's the Clouds who provide the wisdom for Socrates and his disciples to be able to carry on their lives in a more religious free way. Okay, well, this all sounds great, but it turns out to be all claptrap, because in reality, Strepsiades is not at all intellectually enough put together to be able to handle the curriculum put forward by Socrates. We actually hear a little bit about that curriculum, that they measure how far fleas jump. They measure the course of the sun and the moon. They have to get up in a basket so that they can get above the atmosphere and so forth. And all of that seems really highfalutin, and it doesn't seem to really relate to anything more practical, like, for instance, how to deal with one's finances. All right, so in the end, Strepsiades ends up washing out of the school. And so first he had actually tried to get his son Phidippides to go. Phidippides first refused. Then Strepsiades went back to Phidippides again now, and he says to him, I really need you to go to the school. So reluctantly, Phidippides goes to visit the school. He meets Socrates, and he meets the right logic and wrong logic, the two means of education. So the right logic is the older version, and in Greek it's called kriton, which means the stronger or superior logic. That's supposed to explain the older, more classical type of tradition of education in Athens that enabled the warriors to fight at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, which would have been over 60 years prior to the production of this play. Wrong logic, which is called heton in Greek, meaning lesser or weaker, is the one that represents the more modern, contemporary way of doing education, and it's much more laissez-faire, letting kids basically get away with whatever they want to get away with, be able to talk back to their elders, to just take warm baths and just louse around, and not necessarily really learn anything really hard or arduous. Turns out, though, that the old prudent way of education put forward by right logic is actually a little bit prurient when it comes to boys. So although this is supposed to be the old-fashioned way of doing things, it doesn't actually come across as anything boys really should be learning about in the company of such a teacher. And on the other hand, whatever wrong logic puts forward is just all gadabout stuff and lazy stuff. Where wrong logic finally, shall I say it, trumps right logic is on the subject of gays. It turns out that homosexuals have a particular nasty punishment that they suffer involving a radish sort of dug into an orifice. And it turns out that quite a few of the members of the audience have suffered this indignity. And when the right logic realizes this, pointed out to him by wrong logic, he ends up surrendering. And so wrong logic ends up being the form of education that Phidippides will end up learning from. So Phidippides does learn argumentation sufficient to get his father Strepsiades out of debt, and Strepsiades is able to argue his way out of debt with a couple of his creditors. But then Phidippides at a party suddenly turns his energy on Strepsiades. He starts beating him after an argument, and he claims that it's okay for him to beat him because Strepsiades beat him, so the father could do it to the son. Doesn't it make sense that the son should be able to do it to the father? So he almost actually convinces Strepsiades that it's okay. So his argumentation is really excellent. But then he says he's going to do it to his mother. That's too much. And then Strepsiades finally goes really crazy. He rejects the clouds. He rejects the form of education that he's gotten. There was even this earthenware pot called a dinos, which also is another word for a whirl in Greek, and that was supposed to be the new god. Strepsiades finally rejects that as well and finally gets back to worshiping Zeus. And finally, Strepsiades sets fire to the school in the climactic scene of this version of Clouds. So, and again, as I mentioned in a previous video, you should check out or review Another Brick in the Wall by Pink Floyd. It's a climactic scene. There's a startling connection between those two. Now, how does this relate to old comedy? So I'll give you this example so that you can handle the discussion questions on this subject if you decide to pursue this. So the prologue of the play would be the beginning of the play when Strepsiades is first describing his debt-ridden issue with the audience, and then is conversing with his son Phidippides about the school. Then, of course, he goes to the school, he meets Socrates, and he's going to get initiated into the cult. The clouds show up in order to initiate Strepsiades. The appearance of the cloud is the parodos. Okay, so you have the prologue, beginning of the play, and then the parodos is the the point when the clouds appear, and the chorus in general appears. Then there's that long discussion between Socrates and Strepsiades. That actually acts in a way kind of like a first agon, which is the debate. After they disappear down into the cave, that's when the clouds address the audience, and that's the parabasis. Then after Socrates and Strepsiades come back, Strepsiades, as you remember, gets thrown out of the school, and he goes and gets Phidippides, and Phidippides comes back over. So then we have the real agon, the real debate, which is the two logics. And you'll notice how it's formally set up with those long speeches punctuated by choral interludes. That's the way that an agon is typically set in Old Comedy. After that agon, then you have a whole series of episodes where you have Strepsiades and Phidippides now able to talk their way out of his debts. But then after that comes the beating scene, and there's even a small agon there. And then the Exodus ends up being the point when Strepsiades burns the school down. There is something actually unusual about this ending. It's usually supposed to be a very celebrative one, with lots of festivals and girls and wine and so forth. And having this almost quasi-tragic ending, and especially with the clouds who come in and say, okay, you see, you learned your lesson now, Strepsiades. It was wrong for you to act immorally this way by trying to get out of your debts. And so that sort of finger shaking followed by the consequent tragic reaction against Socrates and Chaerephon and the other students is a little unusual, in fact, for comedy. Now, we don't know, because of the revision issue, we don't know whether, in fact, this play was actually set up as the original play was, but we have reason to suspect, based on ancient commentary, that it was not. So we're not even sure if the debate of the logics was there, and we don't know whether the school was burned down in the final scene as is depicted in this revision. So that obviously complicates things for us to be able to understand how this all went. But at least we can see that pretty much as the play is currently set up, it does follow fairly closely the standards of Old Comedy. So now, what is Aristophanes trying to get across here? Well, the sophists were these paid educators who sometimes did have schools and more frequently traveled around the Greek world and taught various subjects for pay. That might be mathematics, generalship, cooking, astronomy, whatever it might happen to be. Some of them were very respectable, such as Gorgias, the one from Leontini in Sicily, who taught rhetoric, but other ones were more questionable. And some of them did have the reputation of challenging religion with regard to worship of gods. Protagoras is the one who famously said, man is the measure of all things, and he was also the one who apparently was very skilled at making a wrong argument look like the right one, or a weaker argument look like a stronger one, which of course ties in with that right logic and wrong logic that we see in this revision. So sophists were one of the principal forms of education in ancient Athens, and they are essentially post-Persian wars, which meant that they would not have been part of that sort of classical period that superior logic refers to when he goes back to the Battle of Marathon. This would have been before the sophists really got going. So this is a period of intellectual ferment, but it also has the potential to produce quackery or charlatanism, and therefore to weaken the spirit of education. And that's kind of also what actually both right logic and wrong logic, interestingly, both kind of admit that the new way of education is essentially this sort of modified, laissez-faire type of education that really doesn't necessarily get the boys really to learn anything really tough, the way that you might, for instance, envision Spartan youths having to learn how to go out and fight. So the movement of the sophists, therefore, is really a double-edged sword when it comes to education. And so Aristophanes appears to be putting a lot of emphasis on education as an important facet of Athenian life from the standpoint of policy, especially war policy, given that they are now in the middle of this really major war with Sparta. So education, of course, is an abstract concept that Athenians have to pay attention to, especially since they have so much intellectual interest themselves. But it also has the practical side of getting people prepared, both physically prepared and mentally prepared when they have to deal with real political and military matters. And that might be true in general anyway, since after all the Athenians were in charge of an empire, but it's especially true now because the Athenians are in this major war with one of the most accomplished war-fighting cities out there, the Spartans, who have a very inimical relationship with the Athenians, even in the best of terms, and now, of course, are completely turned against the Athenians. So essentially, Clouds, therefore, brings to light the conflict in Athens regarding what kind of education one, in fact, is supposed to have. And it demonstrates how the misguided effort of Strepsiades to use education for an ill purpose ends up redounding on his own family and then eventually also on the school that taught him. Okay, well, this finally concludes the first group of videos that you've had in a session related to actual ancient comedy, and we're now going to be moving on to the next session in which you'll be completing your video day related to Aristophanes' Clouds and your first look at modern satire as it relates to ancient comedy. Okay, we'll see you in the next session and the next video.